Welcome to Between the Before and After, a podcast about the stories that shape us. I'm your host, Coach John McClernand, and each episode I bring you an inspiring guest with a moving story that shines a light on the power of the human spirit. Before we dive in, I want to let you know about two very important things. Number one, the stories shared here are often gritty, raw, and vulnerable, and very likely will include speaking about sensitive topics suited for a mature audience. Number two, this podcast is also broadcast live on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So on whatever platform you follow myself or Freedom Nutrition Coaching, you have the opportunity to participate in this discussion during the live stream. And we encourage your participation both by commenting and asking questions. And so this podcast is about exploring the stories that take place between the before and after photos, not just in the realm of weight loss, but in all areas of life. So let's dive in. All right, welcome back to Between the Before and After. Excited to have with me today Laura DeSisto. Hopefully I said that right. And Laura, you've got a really cool story here, and I'm excited to dive in. But before we dive into how you got into scuba diving with man-eating sharks and other cool things like that, if people want to catch up with you, where do they find out? Because we're going to explore part of your story, but they're probably wanting to know more of your story. So where can they find you?
Okay, so first of all, John, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your podcast. As a matter of fact, just before we hopped on, I was listening to a recent episode about a woman who got her black belt. So that was really cool.
Yeah. Shout out to Cheryl.
Yeah. So at any rate, they can find me on my website, which is simply lauradesisto.com. They can also find me on Instagram. Love to post on Instagram at Laura_N as in Nancy _DeSisto. Pretty easy to find on Facebook. I think I'm just Laura DeSisto.
Cool.
Yeah.
We'll include those links in the description as well, which is fantastic. So we're talking about how you went from a middle-aged empty nester who was maybe depressed and frustrated with life, kind of staring down the barrel of what comes next, to ultimately becoming a scuba diver who dives routinely with man-eating sharks, which sounds pretty epic. So let's rewind the clock a little bit here and say, and you can go back as far as you feel comfortable, but how did things kind of start for you?
Okay, so going way back, which is where I start in my book. I loved the ocean as a child. Absolutely loved it. Loved to swim. I grew up in coastal New England, and most of us learn how to swim early and well, and I was no exception. But unfortunately, that all changed when I saw the movie Jaws in theaters with my friends. I was, along with a lot of other peers, I was completely traumatized, and I literally wouldn't set foot in the ocean for decades. All of us were like afraid to go in a pool. It was just pathological. It was just, that movie was just ruined it for us. That's one piece of my story. And then the other piece of my story is that I always loved to read and write. And my earliest childhood dream was to write a book. And in fact, I was an English major in college. And then when I graduated, I immediately started in a career in writing advertising copy. Okay. And once my first son was born, my husband and I made the decision that I would be the primary caretaker for lots of reasons. I quickly had 2 more children. And so even though I, freelanced as a writer throughout the time my kids were growing up, I became more of a mother than anything else. And honestly, I lost myself in parenting, like a lot of other women in my age bracket, but also in my, I think, socioeconomic circle who stayed home. I became, overly involved in parenting in an unhealthy way. I think I took on my kids' identities. And so when they left the nest, I felt like I fell off a cliff. I just didn't have enough of my own self left to figure out what the next step was. And my husband was still working crazy hours. And so I was, spending a lot of time alone. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how far apart were your kids?
So the first 2 were very close in age. They were less than 2 years apart. And in our neck of the woods, they call those Irish twins.
Well, I guess my brother and I are Irish twins then.
Mm-hmm. How far apart are you from your brother?
14 months.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
Yeah.
And then my next son was actually almost 4 years younger than my daughter. However, he begged us to go to boarding school. And so I thought I had 4 more years left of parenting when my daughter went off to college. But we didn't want to do it, but he kind of pounded away at us, and we ended up going to visit this school that was like the perfect fit for him. And so we allowed him to go. And so at the same time that my daughter went, he went off to boarding school, and that's when I really kind of fell off a cliff.
Yeah. So he was 14, if I'm doing math, 13 or 14 and heading to boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
What even planted the idea in his head that he wanted to go to boarding school?
So a couple things. One, he for middle school, he went to a Montessori school.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm. So it just so happened that a lot of the kids in his grade, it was a very small grade, but for whatever reason, in his particular grade, a big percentage of the kids were going to boarding school. And so that's where he got the idea originally. And then he did admit to me not long ago that part of it was that he didn't want to be here alone. He didn't want to be under the microscope without any other siblings, which is kind of smart if you think about it.
Yeah, interesting. So he's pretty switched on then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and pardon me, when he's at boarding school, he's gone for 3-4 months at a time before coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
At that time, then I guess we didn't have internet in the same way that we do now. So, I mean, I don't know how far back we're going here, but was communication limited to phone, or was what era are we talking here?
No, it was like 10 years ago. So
okay.
He had a cell phone and we would text and all that, but it wasn't so much the lack of communication with him. It's more like, I lost my job in a sense, right? If you think about it, like my whole life was, you get up, you take the kids to school, you focus on dinner, maybe there's soccer practice. I mean, all those things were gone. So I kind of lost the structure of my day.
Yeah. And you said you've been a freelance copywriter. And for those who don't know, I mean, so you're writing advertising copy, was it? Or
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like the business of words to convince people to be interested in certain things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you enjoy copywriting?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I also loved the environment of being around like super creative, whip smart people. So when I left to stay home with the kids, that was something that I really, really missed. I then, in addition to doing copywriting, once I was home with the kids, I started writing feature stories for magazines. So my writing expanded, and I also wrote, and I still do, I write, web content. But always in the background was this steady undercurrent, this steady drumbeat of write a book.
Yeah.
But there were a couple of things getting in my way. And one of them was that I never felt passionate enough about any of the ideas that I had about a particular book. And so that all changed when I started scuba diving, because it set off this series of events in my life that I never could have dreamed of.
Yeah.
And so,
So when you were a child and you were thinking like, I want to write a book, were you picturing at that point in time writing a fiction book, like, or were you thinking writing some kind of biography, historical, that kind of thing? What were you picturing?
No, I definitely thought I would write fiction. And as an adult, I had, an endless number of like notebooks strewn about the house where I would start writing, a fiction piece or novel. And I would just lose interest and kind of hide it in a drawer, to the point where it was almost embarrassing for myself, because like, I'd go to clean a drawer and I'd be like, oh God, that's right, I started that book and I lost interest, or I didn't complete it. So I just didn't ever feel jazzed about it. And in fact, when I went to write this book, I never intended on writing a memoir. I thought that it would be either like a true story, nonfiction, or, or like a travel log kind of thing, or it would be fiction based on a true story. But when I started working with my editor, she saw the first draft and she said it's a memoir. And I really pushed back. I didn't want to write a memoir because I love reading memoirs, but I always felt that they were you had to be way too vulnerable as an author to write one. And I didn't want to do that.
That's very interesting, right? We think, why do we not want to share our stories? And what I love about being human and the way that our brain works is that we really learn from stories, and innately storytelling is just a unique part of being human. And so we think about, like, facts don't really change minds, but stories really create and evoke emotion and imagery. And so when we tell a real story, and that's even what I want to do in this podcast here, is like tell people stories, because that's where we find inspiration and hope. And so what like prompted you to take up scuba diving? So you watched Jaws, and it came up back in 1975, I think. And I never actually watched the movie. I did, I of course I know the famous ominous theme song and whatnot, and it, maybe I should watch it. But what made you go, I want to go back into the ocean again? And how long was it from the time that you got like traumatized by Jaws to the time you sort of went back in the ocean with any degree of confidence?
Mm-hmm. It was decades, honestly. It was literally decades. And, the other part of my story is that not only did I love the ocean as a child and, loved swimming, I loved the show, The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau.
Oh, yeah.
That was my favorite show. And so I would watch that show, and that I'd go to bed and I'd have like visions or dreams of me under the water, as a scuba diver.
Yeah.
And again, that dream was cut short by this movie. So what happened was I had a very, very, and I still do have a very close friend. She's featured prominently in my book. Her name is Buffy. I use her real name. That's her nickname, but that's what we call her. At the time, she lived across the street from me, and she and her husband and her then teenage son were avid scuba divers. And sometimes they would come over to our house with their underwater footage from their GoPro, and we'd put it up on our big TV, and I would just watch it and think, oh man, like I've always wanted to do that. And maybe I said it enough times. And one day she said to me, let's just go on a little like girls trip. Let's go to the Bahamas, to this place where we go all the time to dive. It's really safe. The staff is really safe. And we'll take our friend Tracy with us. And in a moment of insanity, I guess, I said yes. I mean, it never occurred to me that I would see a shark. I figured she would never do that to me. She knew I was so scared of them. So off we went on this trip. And as I detail in the book, on the very first dive, which was part of this program called Discover Scuba, which is a program that has been devised by an organization called PADI, or the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. And so if you go to a lot of resorts around the world will have like a PADI center. And if you want to try, they sometimes call it a resort course. That's the other thing they call it. But technically it's like Discover Scuba. And so.
Yeah. And you're how old now at the time going on this vacation?
I think I was like, maybe like 51, 52, somewhere in that area, but in very good shape. Like I've always been like super active and, in good shape. So physically I felt very comfortable doing it. And, I had still kept up swimming. Like, in fact, Buffy and I had done some triathlons around the same time. And so I had been swimming a lot. So I wasn't worried about that. That wasn't an issue. Mm-hmm. And I've always been comfortable, like going under the water and even deep, holding my breath, like in snorkel or something. So anyway, off we went, and we did the little training in the pool. It's kind of a crazy program. Now that I've been trained as a diver and I know everything that goes into it and how dangerous it really is, I still can't believe that they allow people to just like take this half an hour, like on land training where they give you a very cursory description of like the different hand signals that the dive master's potentially going to give you.
Right. Yeah.
And the equipment. And then, you go in the pool with the equipment for half an hour. And then the next thing you know, you're in the open ocean. It's just kind of
Right.
insane.
Right.
But
So just out of curiosity, what would you
Mhm.
add in? Because I've worn breathing apparatuses, but it was actually for firefighting, so it wasn't underwater. But
Yeah.
in that instance, we still have to regulate our oxygen consumption and
hmm
whatnot. We're not dealing
Yeah.
with like pressure shifts and whatnot. So
hmm
what would you
Yeah.
add to a course like that?
I don't know. I think I would say this, that if you're going to do it, I would really investigate the reputation of the dive center, because in my case, we went to a really, really, really safe
Hmm.
5-star PADI center, and I think they've had one fatality, and it was somebody who had a heart attack. So it wasn't even
Mm.
related to what they did wrong. So they were, I'm not kidding you. This dive instructor had his hand on my arm like the whole time. He kind of never let me go. There were only a few of us that weren't certified divers, and he would like adjust all my equipment. And they did like an underwater video of it that you could buy in the dive shop after. I wasn't even conscious of the fact that somebody was there. I was so nervous. But we
Mm-hmm.
watched the video afterwards, and I could see him doing all this stuff that I didn't even know he was doing. He was adjusting my weight belt. He was deflating my BCD. He was doing all the stuff that I eventually learned how to do on my own. So in my case, I feel like it was very, very safe, but I could see how in the wrong hands. And I
Right.
unfortunately have heard of incidents where, this didn't go so well and people have died on these little discovered scuba trips. But
Yeah.
I
How deep
don't,
did you go in your first dive?
I want to say 50 feet.
Okay. Yeah.
hmm
So that's a significant. Even that is a significant shift in pressure
Oh,
from the
yeah.
surface. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, you feel it when
definitely.
you dive, like, I don't know, 10 feet down into
hmm
a pool. You already start to
hmm
feel like the difference. You feel the weight of the water on you. So you got into 50 feet. Yeah, the pressure is already pretty significant. And yeah, I think it's important you highlight that you had an instructor with you that was like managing all these different aspects of diving and making sure that you were being safe, where you're suggesting or saying that, like, in some of these situations, you don't have that level of care and attention. You're kind of left to your own devices. And that's where the element of risk comes in.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there's other risks to it too. Like you could have a stroke and not even know why. You could have like some undetected medical condition. I mean, there are risks to it, but I think with good training and in the right hands, you can mitigate it enough that, it's not astronomical. It's not like,
Right. Yeah.
you know, a death defying feat, kind of thing. But like anything in life, driving down the street, there are risks. So
Yeah. Yeah. So you're on your first dive here, and how long did the dive last for?
I want to say definitely under an hour. I would say if I had to take a stab at it, I'd probably say like 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm. And what sticks out to you from that first dive? So, maybe you're sitting on the edge of the boat, you tip backwards into the water,
hmm
and what's your first thought?
Uh, well, I don't want to give too much away because I really want people to read my book, but I will say that I had an encounter on that first dive with a shark. And if you'd asked me ahead of time what I would do in that situation, I would probably have told you that I would just have a heart attack right there and then, and that the shark wouldn't have to eat me because I'd be dead in the water.
Right.
I didn't react that way. I was
Cool.
fascinated by it. Fascinated by it. I mean, it came within inches of me. And
Wow. Yeah.
oh, yeah, I could have touched it. And I could see its eye tracking me. I mean, they're
Yeah.
very curious. And you're in their territory. They tend to stay on the same reef. These are reef sharks, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they migrate actually from the Bahamas, but they want to know are you competition? Are you here to try to eat my fish that I'm trying to eat? Like, what are you? They're very curious, and I think they're a lot smarter than people realize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Once they figure out you're not their food and you're not a threat, they leave you alone. But as a result of this encounter and the diving experience itself, I came up, I resurfaced, which is funny. That's the name of my book. I resurfaced and I immediately went to Buffy, who was on the boat. She wasn't on the dive because she was already a certified diver. And I said, that's it. I'm hooked. I want to come back down and become a certified diver. And that's exactly what I did. I went down within a month, and I did all the training, the dry land training, the book learning I did online, which you can do now. You didn't used to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And I passed the course online, and then I went back down and I did the actual training that it takes to become a certified diver. And then about a year later, I did more training and I became an advanced diver.
So the very thing that terrified you, mm-hmm. it seems almost serendipitous, maybe, if I can use that word. So the very thing that like terrified you, traumatized you, and kept you out of the water for decades is like one of the first things that happens to you the first time you go into the water. And maybe that was meant to be, because mm-hmm. it just took that away. You go, okay, I've had that encounter now. And it wasn't anything like I thought it was going to be, like these just terrifying, bloodthirsty, vicious beasts who just mm-hmm. come after you from like a mile away, you know?
Exactly. And
like a really curious kind of intelligent creature that was fascinating.
Yes. And a lot of people get, they become divers, certified divers, and they become interested in very specific things. Like there's people who get really hooked on underwater photography, and you can imagine like all the different equipment and how far you can go with that. There are people who get really into like the microscopic tiny little, life on the reef, and they start taking pictures of those, or they go to different places where that maybe they can dive with little seahorses or something like that. In my case, I became so fascinated with sharks that I started seeking out adventures where you could go on these shark feeding dives and have encounters with sharks on purpose. So, for example, my husband and I went to Bimini, which it has a group of endangered, they call them great hammerheads. So there's hammerhead sharks, run-of-the-mill hammerhead sharks. Mm-hmm. And then there are the great hammerheads, which are rare, and they're only found reliably in certain parts of the world. Bimini is one of them. The Bahamas, by the way, is sharks are protected. You're not allowed to fish for them. So it's considered mm-hmm. the shark capital of the world. It has the most sharks of anywhere, as far as we know. Right, yeah. And so anyway, we went on this shark feeding dive with these great hammerheads. And I mean, I think some of them, if I remember correctly, can get up to 20 feet. They're enormous. Right. And the heads, these hammerheads are just unbelievable. And the eyes on the end, and talk about like an eye tracking you. And I described that particular dive in my book. And that was wild. That was incredible.
No kidding. I mean, what a fascinating and kind of like almost like goofy creature in one sense. Like, why do they have this hammerhead? Literally, Well, they've evolved to almost like suck up bottom dwelling creatures. So their main diet is stingrays. So they almost like hoover them up. Interesting.
Because their mouth is on the bottom.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Fascinating. Yeah. And so you get fascinated by sharks and you decide this is what I want to do. So when you're going on a shark dive where you're deliberately like going to feed them, because I think I saw a video clip of a fellow he went down in like a shark cage, but something broke. Mm-hmm. And no, actually, no, I think what it was is the shark actually rammed it multiple times, and it broke. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was, so you end up having this quite terrifying encounter with a very, very large shark. Mm-hmm. It thankfully ended well. He was able just to swim back to the boat, but you can imagine it's like, oh boy, he's coming close. He's swimming pretty fast, and like, wham, whatever structure he was mm-hmm. in, maybe they didn't expect like the shark to hit it with that sort of degree of force. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, he had a bit of a terrifying encounter. When you're going down in these shark feeding things, are you going down in some kind of protective cage?
No, you're not. I think that there are certain tour operators that use cages, but mm-hmm. not the ones we've been on. I think probably the most terrifying one we did was we dove on purpose with tiger sharks. And You want to talk about enormous. I mean, they look like little mini school buses underwater. And again, like there's mini school buses with
like a lot of teeth.
Right. There's only certain places in the world where you can do this. Again, Bahamas. Like it's off the western end of Grand Bahama. You get on a boat. It's maybe like an hour out. And the tour operators that do this most of them are very safe. They're extremely well trained, and they spend the whole time you're going out to the dive site prepping you, like, do this, don't do that. And on this particular dive, I'll never forget his name is Neil Watson. You can look him up. They're very famous for doing this kind of thing. And Neil said, think about how far we are from land. If one of you gets bitten, we're miles from Miami, or, like, we're probably not going to be able to save you. So you really need to pay attention. And what they tell you about tiger sharks is that they like to ambush from behind. All sharks do. They know when you're looking at them. It's some instinctual thing. So you never, ever turn your back on them. Never, ever, ever. And they give you these sawed off PVC pipes to hold. And they tell you if the shark gets too close, you need to poke it in the nose, because they have very, very sensitive snouts. They have a lot of receptors there. And so on occasion, we would have to do that. And that is a little hairy. But, there's a shark feeder there with a box of bait. So essentially, they've chummed the water to attract the sharks. Once the sharks figure out where the bait is, they basically leave everybody alone, because they just want their diet is fish. Their diet isn't humans. So So it's just really in the beginning, because the sharks can kind of smell they sense the bait in the water, and they're kind of going all over trying to find it. And that's when you have to be vigilant about not turning your back on one.
Well, and how many sharks are there at a time in these sorts of encounters? Because I would think, like, they don't necessarily swim in packs all in the same direction, do they?
No. So it varies greatly. There are disappointing times when you go and no sharks show up. I mean, we've had one of those dives, and it's a huge bummer, because first of all, you've gone all this way, and secondly, it's very expensive and you don't get your money back. But on the hammerhead dive, we actually had a lot. We probably had, I bet you there were 8 great hammerheads. There were a ton. On our particular tiger shark feeding experience, I think maybe 5 or 6 showed up. But the thing is, like, you're not just attracting tiger sharks, you're bringing in a slew of sharks from all over. They're so sensitive to, fish guts. So honestly, like, in a way, sometimes it's the other sharks that you're not intending to bring in that are the most troublesome. And on this particular dive that we did, Neil Watson was experimenting with bringing the other sharks up to the surface, because the shark feeders don't like other sharks darting in and out and trying to get the chum away from the tiger sharks, because you can imagine what that's like. You're dealing with this giant creature who's coming to get the fish, and now you've got this other shark coming at you. So he was experimenting, bringing the sharks up. And when I went into the water to do the giant stride entry, is what they call it, this lemon shark that I didn't see coming came up and smashed me in the chest, because it thought that I was chum, because they had been throwing chum into the water. And so these sharks were all like looking for stuff on the surface. They were all kind of primed for this, and it bumped me so hard, like right in the chest, because it thought I was chum. Didn't bite me, thank God. Which in a way shows you they're smarter than you think.
Yeah,
somehow you probably knew at the last second that I wasn't.
So you hit because you hit the water, and are you momentarily disoriented when you make your entry into the water?
A little bit. I'd say more so when you're a really new diver. I would say that you are, because you're so. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to plug my computer in. You have so many thoughts in your head. It's sort of like if you learn a new sport, and let's say you're learning tennis for the first time, and you're going, oh, put my racket back. Oh, the grip. Oh, put your left foot forward. Like when you're first learning to dive, you have so much of that in your head when you jump in, you're really like, you're focused all on that. But when you get to the point where it's second nature, like riding a bike, you're focused more on the environment. So I wouldn't say anymore that I feel that way.
Yeah. And so, but fairly early on in your dives, you started diving for sharks. You mentioned that great hammerheads are they endangered, or are they critically endangered?
I think they are critically endangered. I think the last time I looked it up, they were critically endangered. Yes. I'm pretty sure.
Are they critically endangered because of humans fishing them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I mean, there's so many shark species that are endangered. And part of it is because in some cultures, what they call shark fin soup is considered a delicacy. And it's really sad because they catch these sharks and they cut their fins off and they throw them back in the water alive, and they drown. I mean, it's just brutal.
Yeah. Cruel.
So I like to think of myself, along with a lot of other people, as almost like a shark ambassador, because once you dive with them and you have all these encounters, you start to see them for what they are, and they're just not the man-eating vicious creatures that they're made out to be. And I think it's great that Shark Week on Discovery, I've noticed a change in the last several years. They seem to be not featuring as much, like, attacks on people. I mean, it does happen, but it's 9 times out of 10, it's mistaken identity. It's a shark in, maybe murky water thinking you're a fish. And what's so interesting is, if you read the encounters, a lot of people who survive these attacks will say, well, it bit me once and then it swam away. And it's because they know once they take a bite, they're like, you're not fish. And they, if they wanted to finish you off, they could. The fact that a lot of, most people survive shark attacks says a lot.
Absolutely. And that you really answered one of the questions. Is, I think, doing this kind of work, you must basically become, or want to become, an ambassador for sharks and a conservation of sorts. And maybe there's a second book in the offing if you haven't already written it. I'm not sure how many books you've written at this point, but maybe at least there's a second book about, like, the different sharks, and what you've learned from them. And I'm sure some of this is detailed in your book, your first book as well. But I think maybe there's probably more than one book in the offing here to write about sharks, and just to help further the education. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure I will do more books about. And the first book isn't really about sharks, as you know. It's a memoir. But and I'm kind of thinking I might want to write a thriller, but maybe the thriller will be, a scuba diver. That would be really cool.
Or you can make the shark the protagonist.
I like it.
All right, coming with ideas live on air. Well, Laura, I think it's absolutely fascinating. You've certainly piqued my interest, more so in sharks than before. I already had an appreciation for them, sort of top of food chain. I think I recognize their importance in the ecosystem, but to kind of hear it described as this, I'm like, that would be really cool, and something that I would very much enjoy doing. And so, for folks that are listening to this, if you could have them just take maybe one nugget away from your story and from our conversation today, what would you like people to take away from this?
Let's see. Well, I certainly want them to find my book on Amazon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is Resurfacing, Sisterhood, Sharks and Storms by Laura DeSisto. But
great title.
Thank you. I resurfaced into my own life as a result of these experiences. But I would say, because I've actually given some talks about this, that if you're trying to figure out your purpose, if you're trying to figure out, your dreams, because I think sometimes people still struggle with that, their whole lives, especially like midlife and on, maybe like you're at the point where you've subsumed them so much for your family or your career that you kind of lost the thread of what you're really about. That if you think back to your childhood and the things that really sparked your imagination from a really early age, because I'm a firm believer we're born who we are for the most part. Obviously there's environmental influences. Absolutely. But so I think it would be to think of
3 or 4 years old, and you think, like, what, who was I maybe before people were telling me, or society was telling me what I was supposed to be?
Exactly. And so when I look back, I'm like, I loved swimming. I loved the ocean. I loved Jacques Cousteau. I loved reading. I loved writing. And here we are at mid-age. Those two dreams have resurfaced and they've dovetailed into this book project in a way that I never could have imagined. So if I didn't face my fear, my really lifelong fear of sharks, to pursue this other, this big dream of mine, I never would have resurfaced. I never would have written my book. Sometimes you have to just, face down your fears to come alive again. And so that would be what I would want them to take away, that it's worth it.
Absolutely. So your fears are often pointing to the thing that you want the most. And I think maybe we could say that fear often is connected to the disappointment we might feel if we don't actually accomplish that thing we set out to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love that. So you use almost like let fear in some sense be a bit of your guide towards uncovering what you really want from this life. And we only get one kick at this. And so I think you've done a wonderful job of really diving into this second half of your life and living with a really incredible and amazing purpose. So thank you so much for being on the show today. It's truly been a pleasure, a great story. And definitely for those who are listening, I would strongly encourage you to go and check out Resurfaced. Sisterhood
Resurfacing.
Resurfacing. There we go.
On Amazon.
Mm-hmm. On Amazon. Sisterhood, Sharks, and Storms.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. I'm not sure the order of the words, but anyways,
you got it right. I did.
Awesome. I've been listening carefully. But it's been a pleasure having you on today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, John.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Between the Before and After. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, or leave a review, because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. I love exploring the stories that take place between the before and after, the powerful experiences that shape who we become. And I love human potential. I love the possibilities that lie within us. So whatever you may be up against, I hope these stories inspire you, because if you're still here, your story's not done yet, so keep moving forward.
Anyone can come from any place of brokenness and destitution and build an amazing life.